Welcome to the O Horror Podcast. Join me as I take you on a journey of the senses and the mind into the darkness. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. The Ash Tree. Visitors to Castringham Hall in Suffolk will find it almost unchanged from the days when our story took place. They can still see the beautiful house with its gardens and lake. However, the one thing missing is the ash tree, which used to stand proud and tall in front of the house, its branches almost touching the walls. This story begins in 1690 with a strange, lonely old woman, Mrs. Mothersole, who was found guilty of being a witch. Sir Matthew Fell, the owner of Castringham Hall at the time, described how she used to climb into the ash tree outside his bedroom every night there was a full moon. He said that she usually carried a strange knife to cut off parts of the tree, and that she talked to herself. Once he followed her home, but she disappeared, and when he knocked on the door of her house, she came downstairs in her nightclothes looking sleepy. He and the villagers agreed that it was certain she did these things by magic, and so she was hanged. Before she died, she fought and shouted, and her last strange words were, "There will be guests at the hall." After the hanging, Sir Matthew felt uncomfortable and guilty, and he told his friend the vicar about his worries. "You did the right thing, Sir Matthew," were the wise words of the vicar. "I'm sure she was a dangerous woman." Sir Matthew felt happier after that. That evening, Sir Matthew and the vicar went for a walk in the gardens of Castringham Hall. It was the night of the full moon. As they were returning to the house, Sir Matthew pointed to the ash tree in great surprise. "What kind of animal is that running down the ash tree? It looks very strange." The vicar only saw the moving animal for a moment, but he thought it had more than 4 legs. He shook his head. "I must be tired," he thought to himself. After all, what animal has more than 4 legs? He said nothing to Sir Matthew, but wished him good night. The next morning, Sir Matthew's servants were surprised not to find him downstairs at his usual time of 6 o'clock. When 7 o'clock and then 8 o'clock passed, they began to suspect that something was terribly wrong, and they went up to check his bedroom. The door was locked. After knocking several times and still getting no answer from inside, they broke down the door and entered to find that their fears were right. Sir Matthew's body was lying on the bed, dead, completely black. There were no wounds or other marks on him, and everything in the room looked as usual except that the window was wide open. His servants at first suspected poison, but the doctor who was called in found no such thing and could offer no real explanation for Sir Matthew's death. When he heard the news, the vicar rushed to Castringham Hall, and while he was waiting to hear the doctor's opinion, he looked at Sir Matthew's Bible, which was lying on the table by the dead man's bedside. He opened the book, and the first words he read were from the book of Luke, chapter 8. "Cut it down," were the words he read. The servants locked Sir Matthew's room that day, and it stayed locked up for the next 40 years. By that time, Sir Richard Fell, Sir Matthew's grandson, was living at Castringham Hall. He enjoyed spending money, especially on rebuilding parts of the hall. He also decided to make the local church bigger, so that his family could have a fine new seat in the new part of the church. In order to complete this building work, some of the graves in the graveyard had to be moved. One of the graves was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the old witch who began this story. The villagers were excited about the opening of her grave, and a crowd came to watch. However, they and the workmen were amazed to find the grave completely empty, no body, no bones, and no dust. At about this time, Sir Richard started to sleep very badly. The wind made his fire smoke and the curtains move, and Because of his room facing east, the sun woke him up early in the morning. One morn he asked his servant to help him choose a better room, and he made a tour of the house, finding something wrong with each room. Each one was either too cold or too noisy, or it faced the wrong direction. Finally, he found himself outside his grandfather's old room. His servant tried to persuade him not to go in. "It's a bad room, sir. They say terrible things happened in there, and no one has opened the door since the death of your grandfather. Also, the ash tree is right outside the window, and it's always unlucky, sir." But Sir Richard was not listening. He unlocked the door and walked straight in. "See? Nothing unusual here, James," he said, and he opened the window. As he did so, he noticed how tall and dark the ash tree was. Its branches seemed to be trying to reach into the room, but he said nothing. At that moment, a stranger rang the bell at the front door of the hall. The servant brought him up to the bedroom where Sir Richard was standing, looking around at the old paintings and books. "I must apologise for interrupting you, sir," said the stranger, "but please allow me to introduce myself. My name is William Crome. My grandfather was the vicar here in your grandfather's time. I have some papers to deliver to you." "I'm delighted to meet you," said Sir Richard. "James, please bring us some wine in the library and then move my clothes and things into this room for me. I will sleep here in the future." While he was drinking a glass of wine with William Crone in the library, Sir Richard looked at the papers, many of which belonged to his grandfather. Among them, he found the notes made by the old vicar about the day Sir Matthew's mysterious death. "Well, well," said Sir Richard, laughing quietly. "How very interesting. It seems that my grandfather's Bible gave a piece of advice on the day he died, and your grandfather thought it could be about that old ash tree outside the bedroom window. 'Cut it down,' the good book told him. Those were the first words your grandfather saw when he opened the Bible on the day of my grandfather's death." "Do you still have that old Bible?" asked William Crome. "I'd very much like to see it." Sir Richard found the old Bible easily. "Yes, here it is. A bit dusty, I'm afraid. Let's see what it has to tell me. I'll open it at any page and read the first words I see, just as your grandfather did." He opened the book and his eyes fell on the words, "You shall look for me in the morning, and I shall not be there." Sir Richard was sure that the words were again about the ash tree. The Bible was crying to give him some advice. He ordered some of his servants to cut it down the next day. But Sir Richard did not live to see them cut the ash tree down. That night, at exactly midnight, a strange and terrible animal jumped down from Sir Richard's bed, ran silently to the window and disappeared into the shadowy branches of the enormous tree. No one was there to see it, but the next morning they found Sir Richard's body, like his grandfather's, dead and completely black. When William Crome heard the news of his new friend's death, the words from the Bible came back to him, "You shall look for me in the morning, and I shall not be there." He immediately hurried to Castringham Hall, where he found the family and servants crowded round the ash tree. "Sir Richard's last orders were that we should cut down this tree," explained James, and then, in a quieter voice, he went on, "And there's something very strange about that tree, sir. Very strange. It's hollow, and they say something lives inside it." The gardener put his ladder up against the tree and climbed up to look inside. As he held the light over the hole, his face suddenly looked so terrified that several of the people watching from below screamed and turned to run. The gardener himself fell off the ladder, dropping his lamp down the hollow tree, which quickly caught fire. As the tree started to burn, the crowd saw an animal run from the tree. They screamed in horror as they saw its shape and size. It looked like an enormous spider, about the same size as a man's head, covered all over in grey hair. "Look, there's another! Another!" someone shouted. For a long time the men watched these terrifying animals trying to escape from the fire one after the other, and then they killed them with sticks. At last the fire burned itself out, and William Crome, James, the servant, and some of the braver people went to look inside the blackened tree. There they found the bones of a human being. The doctors who examined it afterwards said that it was the body of a woman who died around 1690. the year that Mrs. Mothersole was hanged. A school story. Two men, John and Edgar, were having dinner together one night when a conversation started on the subject of school days. One of them, John, told the following strange story. When I went to school, in September of 1870, I immediately became friendly with a Scottish boy named MacLeod. It was a large school and the teachers changed quite often. One term, a new teacher named Samson came to teach at the school. He taught us Latin. He was tall and pale and with a black beard, and he was popular with the boys because he used to tell us all about his travels to different countries. We always carried an old gold coin in his pocket, which he found on a trip to Turkey, and one day he let us look at this coin closely. On one side of it was the head of a king, I don't know which one, and on the other side of it were the letters GWS for Samson's name, and the date, 24th of July, 1865. We enjoyed Samson's classes because he often asked us to invent sentences of our own, instead of always doing the boring exercises in the grammar book. One day, he asked us for sentences using the word remember in Latin. We all wrote our sentences in the usual way, and Samson came round to correct each of us. My friend MacLeod seemed to be having some difficulty in thinking of a sentence, and when the bell went for break, I saw him write something very quickly, just before Samson reached him. So, MacLeod's sentence was the last one that Samson corrected that day. I waited outside the classroom for what seemed a long time before my friend at last came out. I guessed that he was in trouble for making a mistake. When he did come out, he was looking awfully thoughtful. What happened? Was old Samson angry? I asked. No, my sentence was all right, I think. I wrote, Memento pute interquartotaikos, said MacLeod. Well, what does that mean? That's the funny thing, he explained. I don't really know, you see. I couldn't think of anything else to write, till just before Samson got to me. Then those words just came into my mind out of nowhere. It's very strange. I could see a sort of picture in my head. I think it means, remember the well among the 4 trees. When Samson read it, he went quiet for a long time. Then he started to ask me questions about my family and where I came from. Then he let me go. We soon forgot about the lesson and MacLeod's strange sentence because the next day MacLeod became ill with a cold and he didn't come to school for a week. Nothing happened for about a month until one day when we were again writing Latin sentences for Samson. This time, we had to write them on pieces of paper and give them to him for correction. He started looking through them, but when he got to one piece of paper, he turned white and cried out, looking very frightened. He got up and hurried out of the classroom, and we sat there for a long time, wondering what to do. Finally, I got up to have a look at the papers, and the first thing I noticed was that the top one was in red ink. Our school never allowed us to use red ink. It's against the rules. The sentence on the paper said, Si tu non veneris ad me ego veniam ad te, which means, if you don't come to me, I will come to you. All the boys looked at it and they promised that the sentence was not theirs. To check, I counted the pieces of paper. There were 17 of them, but there were only 16 boys in the class. Where this paper came from, no one could say. I put it in my pocket, and it wasn't until that afternoon that I took it out again. It was completely white. There was no sign of the red writing on it anywhere. I know it was the same piece of paper because I could still see my fingerprints on it. Anyway, Samson eventually came back to the end of the class and told us we could go. He looked at the papers one by one and probably thought it was his imagination playing tricks. He looked pale and worried. The next day, Samson was in school again and he seemed quite normal, but it was that night that the third strange thing happened. It was about midnight when I suddenly woke up. Somebody was shouting at me. It was MacLeod, who shared my room. He looked terrified. Quick, he said. I think it's a burglar. Trying to get into Samson's room. I rushed to the window, but I couldn't see anything. Somehow, though, I felt that something was wrong out there. and the two of us waited, watching closely. "Tell me exactly what you saw or heard," I whispered. "I didn't hear anything, but about 5 minutes before I spoke to you, I found myself standing out at the window." McLeod whispered back, "There was this terrible-looking man standing right outside Samson's window. He was very tall and very thin. He didn't look like a living person at all, more like a ghost. He seemed to be making a sign up to Samson to go with him. That's all I saw before he woke up." We waited a long time, watching, but we saw nothing more that night. Everything was quiet outside. We woke up feeling tired and strange in the morning, but during the day, the news went round that no one could find Samson anywhere. He didn't come for our Latin class that day. In fact, we never heard or saw Samson ever again. Somehow, McLeod and I knew that we should keep our mouths shut about what we'd seen that night, and we never told anyone. "Well, it's a good story, John," said Edgar, listening to his friend as he finished his wine. A very good one, but now I really must be on my way home. I hope I don't meet any strange, thin men on the way." The two men laughed, shook hands, and went their different ways. It was about a year later that Edgar, the listener to John's story, travelled to Ireland to visit another friend who lived in an old country house there. One evening, his host was looking in a box full of various old things for a key that he wanted. Suddenly, he pulled a small object out of the box and held it up. "Have a look at this, Edgar. What do you think it is?" he asked. It was an old gold coin with the head of a king on the front. Edgar looked closely. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "Well, it's an interesting story," began his friend. "A year or two we were working on the area of the garden over there in the corner. Can you see? Among the 4 trees. Right in the middle of the trees we found an old well, and at the bottom of it, you'll never guess what we found." Yes, I will. Was it a body, by any chance?" asked Edgar. His friend was surprised. "Yes, it was. In fact, we found 2 bodies. One of them had its arms tightly wrapped around the other. They were probably there 30 years or more. Anyway, we pulled them out, and in the pocket of one of them we found this old gold coin from Turkey or somewhere by the look of it. It's got something on the back of it too. Can you see what it says?" "Yes, I think I can," said Edgar. "It seems to be the letters GWS and the date, 24th of July, 1865. The curtains. Mr. James Denton's greatest love in life was books. Old ones, most of all. His collection grew bigger and bigger every year, but he lived in his aunt's house, and she was not very happy about this. Mr. Denton was in London one day to buy furniture for a new house which he and his aunt were building, and he was on his way to a shop to choose the curtains. His way took him, quite by chance, past one of the best bookshops in London, and he could not stop himself going in, just for a quick look, as he told himself. He was just walking around the shop, looking at all the different books, when he noticed a small collection of books on the part of England that he came up from. Warwickshire. He spent the next half an hour looking through these and finally decided to buy one that really interested him, called The Diary of Mr. Poynter, 1710. He paid for the book, and then, looking at his watch, he realised that it had been very little time before his train back to Warwickshire left, and he had to rush to the station. He just about caught the train. That night, his aunt questioned him about his trip to London and was very interested to hear about the furniture which was going to arrive soon. Her nephew described every detail, but still she was not satisfied. "And what about the curtains, James?" she asked. "Did you not go?" Suddenly James remembered. Oh dear, he said. "Dial's the one thing I missed. I'm sorry, you see. I was on my way there, quite by chance. I passed Robin's." "Not Robin's the bookshop, I hope," cried his aunt. "Don't tell me you bought more horrible old books, James." Well, only one," he said, feeling a bit guilty. And it's a very interesting one, a diary of someone who used to live not far from here." But he could see that his aunt was not very listening. "You can't go to London again before next Thursday," she was saying. "And really, James, until we decide on the curtains, there's nothing more we can do." Luckily, she decided to go to bed soon after that, and James was left alone with his new book, which he read until the early hours of the next morning. He found this diary with its stories of everyday life at Duck's Tune very interesting. The next day was Sunday. After church, James and his aunt sat in the living room together. "Is this the old book that made you forget my curtains?" asked his aunt, picking it up. "Well, it don't look very good. The Diary of Mr. Poynter, huh?" But she opened the book and looked at a few pages. Suddenly, much to his surprise, she began to show some interest. "Look at this, James," she said. "Isn't it lovely?" It was a small piece of paper pinned to one of the pages of the diary. On it was a beautiful drawing made up of curving lines, which somehow caught the eye. "Well, why don't we get a copy for the curtains if you like it so much?" he suggested, hoping that she would forgive him for his bad memory of the day before in London. His aunt agreed, and the very next day, James took the piece of paper to a company in the nearest town, who agreed to copy it and make it into curtains. About a month later, James was called to inspect the work and was extremely pleased with the result. "Was it a difficult job?" he asked the manager. "Not too difficult, sir, but to tell you the truth, the artist who did the work was very unhappy about it. He said there was something bad in the drawings, sir." James was thoughtful, but still he chose the colours for the curtain and then returned home. A few weeks later, the curtains were ready, and a man came to hang them in several rooms of the new house, one of which was James's bedroom. That night, he found that he could not stop looking at them, and although it was still night, he was almost sure that the curtains were moving, and someone was watching him from behind them. He told himself that this was impossible, and not to be so stupid. He explained to himself that the effect was caused by the curving lines on the curtains, which looked just like long, curling black hair. Next day, a friend of James's came to stay, and after dinner they sat up late, talking and laughing. At last, they decided to go to bed, and James showed his friend the guest room, which was just along from his own. James, though did not want to go to bed immediately, sat in the chair by the fire in his room, reading. He fell asleep for a few minutes, and then when he woke, he realised that something was in the room with him. Putting out his hand, he felt something covered in hair, and thought it was his dog, who always followed him everywhere. "How did you get in here? I thought I left you downstairs," he said, looking down, but to his horror, he found that it was not his little dog, but something almost human. He jumped and screamed, and as he did, the face of the thing came up towards him. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, only hair. He screamed again and rushed to the door, but was so frightened that he could not get it open. He felt the thing touch his back and start to tear at his shirt. At last the door flew open, and he rushed to his friend's room, terrified and breathing hard. The next morning, early, James went away to the seaside for a few days, to try to forget about his horrible experience. He took with him the diary of Mr. Poynter, wanted to read it again, carefully, to find out anything he could about the pattern pinned on the page. When he turned to that part of the book, he found that there were several pieces of paper stuck on top of each other. He carefully pulled off the first two and found this story written by Mr. Poynter in 1707. "Old Mr. Casbury of Accrington told me this day of a young Everard Charlotte, at that time a student of University College. The young man drank too much and broke the law too many times, but because he was from an important family, the university never did anything about it. He used to wear his hair very long and curly down to his neck, and he wore unusual, colourful clothes. His behaviour made his father very unhappy. One day, they found young Sir Everard dead in his room, with all his hair pulled out. No one could explain why or how he died, but the strangest tiding was that the day after he died, the body disappeared completely, leaving only a pile of long, curly black hair on the floor of his room. His father kept some of this hair, and had drawings made out of it, parts of which have pinned to this page. This is the strange story behind the curtains. Before he returned home, James Denton ordered his servants to take them all down and burn them. The flies. If you go to the end of the road, past Colin's house on the left, you'll see a field with some old fruit trees in it. A little house used to be there where a man called Davis lived. He was a very quiet man who seemed to have enough money to live on. He didn't work on the farms, but he always went to town on market days. One day, a young man came back from the market with him. The young man was pale and thin and didn't speak very much. He lived with Davis, and nobody knew if he helped him with housework or if Mr. Davis was his teacher, but people talked and wondered why they were always walking together, early and late, up in the hills and down in the woods. They suspected the two men were playing with magic and were plotting something very terrible. One month, when the moon was full, they went up to a place on the hill with the piles of old stones and rocks, and they stayed up there all night. Someone once asked Mr. Davis why he went to such a dark, lonely place in the middle of the night. Mr. Davis smiled and replied, "I love old places. They remind me of the past. And the air is beautiful on a summer's night. You see all the countryside for miles around on the moonlight." But Mr. Davis's young friend interrupted rudely. "We don't want other people near us. We just want to talk to each other." Mr. Davis seemed annoyed by his young friend's rudeness, and he politely explained, "People say there are bodies under those stones, the bodies of dead soldiers. I know farmers sometimes find old bones in pots when they're working in the fields around here. I'd like to know more about how those old people lived and who their gods were. I think they probably practiced magic." Then one morning in September, something terrible happened. A farm worker had to go up to the top of the hill to the woods very early when it was still dark. In the distance he saw a shape that looked like a man in the early fog. As he came nearer he saw that it was a man. It was Davis's friend, dead, hanging from a tree. Near his feet was a knife covered in blood. The poor farm worker was terrified and ran back down the hill to the village. He woke up some of the villagers to tell them about the terrible sight, and some men went back up the hill with a horse to bring down the body. They also immediately sent a young boy to Mr. Davis's house to see if he was home, because of course they suspected that he was the murderer. When they cut down the young man's body from the tree, they were surprised to see the clothes he was wearing were all black, like the clothes that vicars used to wear many centuries ago. When the men's horse came close to the tree and the dead young man, it screamed and tried to run away, but the men were able to hold it, and they finally got back to the village with the body across the terrified horse's back. In the village they found the young boy standing in the main street, with several women standing around him. He was white as paper and would not say a word. When the men tried to move on towards Mr. Davis's house, the horse again became very frightened. It stopped in the road and would not move. Then suddenly, it turned and tried to run, and the body of the dead young man fell off its back and into the road. The horse could smell blood. They carried the young man's body to Mr. Davis's house, and when they opened the door, they saw what the poor young boy had seen. There, on the long kitchen table, was the body of Mr. Davis. Tied around his eyes was a black handkerchief, and his hands were tied behind his back. His chest was cut open from top to bottom, and his heart was gone. It was an awful sight. The men ran outside for some fresh air. The smell of death in that room was so terrible. Later, they put the young man's body next to Mr. Davis, and they looked carefully around the house. Why were these two men dead? How did they die? In one of the cupboards, they found a small green bottle of strong medicine, often used to put people to sleep. "I think the young man gave Mr. Davis some of this stuff to put him to sleep," one man suggested, looking at the bottle, "and then killed him. Goodness knows why. Perhaps he needed Davis's heart for his magic. Then later perhaps he felt sorry about murdering his friend and went up to the hill and killed himself." The villagers decided that the two men were dead could not lie in the graveyard near the church. They never came to church and they didn't believe in God, they said. They believed in unnatural things and magic. So 12 men covered the bodies in black and took them to a place outside the village. There they dug a big hole and threw the bodies into it and covered them with stones. People say horses don't like going near that place even today, and there is a strange kind of light there. One day, sometime later, some people walking along the road found a pool of blood across it. In the blood There were fat black flies feeding. One man went to get some water and they washed the blood away, but the flies flew up into the air like a dark cloud and flew towards Mr. Davis's house. The villagers decided that no one should live in that house anymore, so they set fire to it, and the house burned down completely. But for a long time people said that they often saw Mr. Davis and the young man standing at night when the moon was full in the road near the burnt house on the hill. Only the flies live there now. Perhaps it's only the flies who know why those two men played with magic and why they died the way they did.